Hello, everyone. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. This is actually the introduction to the future series of podcasts recorded under the Engineering Politics Podcast name. I want to cover what I imagine this podcast will be and how topics will be covered in the future. I'm not 100% sure on how this podcast will evolve or if anyone will listen to it at all. But here we go. You are listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're listening to this. Welcome to the EP podcast. I'm your host and will remain nameless until after I know how this is received. I don't really plan on covering anything too controversial, but you really don't know what is considered controversial anymore. I want to start out this introduction podcast a little more about me. You can find my complete story on the website, engineeringpolitics.com. But I'll give you a brief overview here. I grew up in the Midwest in a blue-collar family. We were religious in a sense that we went to church every weekend. My parents weren't overtly political, but they clearly held some conservative values such as family, hard work, and fiscal responsibility. I grew up working several different manual labor jobs from high school through college. This helped me understand and appreciate earning money and sort of resent those who had money given to them or asked for it. During my time in college, I found ways to pass the time between classes when I wasn't working. I started to use this time to listen to a new medium called podcasts. I was a fan of comedy specials and certain comedians at the time, so naturally I listened to podcasts made by comedians. My favorite podcast being the Joe Rogan Experience. On the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, they had many interesting characters. One of the more interesting ones, and now infamous provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos. There are several reasons why I obviously do not agree with Milo anymore, especially what came out of that podcast, but he was a prominent writer and personality at the Breitbart publication, which is, of course, where I found a much more responsible conservative voice in Ben Shapiro. By finding Ben, it really kind of opened up my eyes to conservative thought more than just the yelling back and forth and bipartisanship. He did a great job at showing kind of the intellect behind conservative thought and how the intellectuals aren't only on the left side, but there are plenty of people on the right who can voice their opinion and stand up for conservative ideals. A lot better than just being provocative like Milo. So Ben was a much better role model to follow. And through Ben, I found several other conservative voices like Steven Crowder, Andrew Klavan, Dennis Prager, and Mark Levin, and even found some liberal voices like Sam Harris, Dave Rubin, and Jonathan Haidt. That led me down the path of politics and learning about why people think the way they think. So I'm here now, speaking into the abyss, hoping someone's listening. Actually, I wanted to start a podcast to record some of the things I've learned from some of the books I've read. I actually might put out a reading list on the website eventually, but I want this podcast to cover the big ideas. There are several conservative podcasts that cover day-to-day news, and I want this one to be different, mostly because the other guys are a lot better at this than I am. Some of the big ideas I want to cover are conservative principles, which include family values, individual liberty, religious freedom, national security, economic freedom, and cultural preservation. Some of the other things I'd like to talk about are differences in behavior between the American left and right, and how each side views morality, and how we don't talk to each other, but we often talk past each other. Very often we get into fights with opposing political parties because we aren't talking about the same thing. Sometimes this is the case because we don't want to give any ground. Thomas Sowell once said in one of his books, and I'm paraphrasing, "Any statement can be true by changing the definition of only one word. A word that comes to mind is equality, where one side thinks equality is not achieved when there are disparities in the outcome, and the other side believes it is moral to try to achieve equality of outcome. These are the types of conflicts I want to cover." I want to stop here to remind anyone who's listening that I will write about almost everything I talk about. This way it'll be easier to cite sources I use. I will attempt to write an article at least once a week and do a podcast associated with that article. I try to keep the article short and to the point, but I failed at my first attempt after writing 2,300 words. All content can be found on the content page on engineeringpolitics.com. You can also follow me on social media on Twitter at ENG_politics. I don't have a Facebook account set up yet, and I'm not sure if I'm going to make one. Maybe one will have been created by the time this podcast is available for download. I'm not on Instagram because I'm not a high school girl. I might make this podcast available on YouTube one day, but please make sure to subscribe to the podcast in whatever app you get your podcasts. Okay, now that the shameless plugging is over, I want to quickly go through the standards I want to set for myself when airing these podcasts. As an avid podcast listener, I appreciate it when a podcast does not use foul language, not because I'm a prude, but because I listen to my podcast in the car with my kids. I hope a cleaner podcast will save you the uncomfortable conversations that I had to have with my kids. You have no idea how hard it is to explain what an interdimensional child molester is after listening to Joe Rogan talk to Alex Jones, so I'll try my best to keep it clean, although that sometimes is a challenge for me. I'm trying to do my best to not over-edit my podcast so I can get used to the uncomfortable feeling of talking to myself. Don't get me wrong, I do occasionally talk to myself, but not normally out loud, or if I do, it's in the shower where no one else can hear me. I want this to be a monologue given from the perspective of conservative to a politically diverse audience. I don't want this to be an echo chamber. I want to do my best to present conservative perspective while also steel manning the other side. Steel manning, if you've ever heard of it before, is opposed to straw manning, which is a term coined by, I believe, Eric Weinstein, meaning to make the best argument possible for your opposition that they will agree with you after you characterize their position. I believe mischaracterizing your opposition's position makes their arguments weak, which in turn makes your argument weak. I'll also do my best to not character attack anyone, although many members of the current Progressive Party make this very difficult for me, but I'll do my best. The best way you, as the audience, can hold me to these standards is to comment on my website and call me out on social media. Just please hold yourself to the same standard as I am when commenting. And now to wrap up this fine podcast, I want to promise you something. I don't expect this podcast or my following to blow up. I'm not doing this for money because I do have a very successful career that I enjoy. Even though I do consider myself a conservative and often vote Republican, I'm not going to shy away from criticizing politicians just because they have a big red R next to their names. I often do find issues with this current president. He may do many things I like, but that doesn't mean I will dismiss everything he does wrong. But I also don't have the Trump derangement syndrome, as many of my friends on the left and right do. Calling balls and strikes is a rare quality in a commentator nowadays. I also don't claim to be objective because clearly I'm not. But I do want to find truth, and not the my truth, because that's a nonsensical phrase. There's only one truth, and if we find it, we can begin to talk about solutions to our problems. Thank you for listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast.